Do you want your teenager to go on the adventure of a lifetime, all the while learning the ability to know God's truth, discern wisely, and take godly action in the world? My name is Andrew Hawk, and I'm the camp director at the Excel Summer Leadership Camp. Every summer, we take teenagers on 2-week adventures to help them grow in their leadership, discernment, and Christ-like character. Between camping, rock climbing, hiking, and whitewater rafting, campers build lifelong friendships while also training in Excel College's game-changing critical thinking method. They'll learn to filter through the cultural messages of the day with godly wisdom, and to learn how to apply those in the method in real-life context through wilderness first aid and CPR training. A few months ago, I received a message from Melissa, one of our past campers. When her mom and her were overseas, her mother got injured, and she used her training to make a huge difference, according to doctors, to be able to get help when it was needed. We love to hear stories like this. Not only do campers leave with practical skills, but also with a deeper faith in Jesus and lifelong community. I want to personally invite your teenager to join us this summer by going to theexcelcamp.org to learn more. That's theexcelcamp.org.
Hey, I'm Greer. Welcome to the Unfinished Idea podcast, a space for you to expand your understanding about the neurodiverse world, which is all around us. Whether you're a parent, a friend, a teacher, or a neighbor, everyone is welcome to join us as we help bring awareness and better understanding about those who are neurodivergent and families who are raising children with special needs. I'm a mom to 2 boys and 2 dogs, and together with my husband, raising a child with additional needs. I often feel lonely and overwhelmed in my daily experience because life looks different for us. This podcast will share practical help, tips, and insights into the difficulties, joys, and differences of the neurodiverse world. So let's start the conversation. Today's conversation is with Merideth, author of the book It All Makes Sense Now, to talk about how life shifts after an ADHD diagnosis and how suddenly so many things can just make sense. Merideth shares her own journey of living for years without realizing she had ADHD, reflecting on the missed signs, daily struggles, and the ways it shaped her life without her even knowing it. She opens up about what it's like to finally receive a diagnosis and how it brought clarity and understanding and self-compassion. I listened to her book, and as I did, I realized she was writing about my life. It was the first kind of big aha moment of me saying, I need to look into this more. So I highly recommend the book, but also this conversation. She is so kind to share some time with us and just talk about life. So let's grab your drink and let's jump into today's conversation. Merideth, as we start this conversation, I first just want to say a huge thank you for writing the book, It All Makes Sense Now. And I listened to it on Audible, so I feel like I know you probably more than just a conversation. But through that book, actually, I say it changed my life because as I listened to it, it felt like you were reading my life and reading my story. And it actually led me to pursue a diagnosis in ADHD. And so I just want to say a huge thank you for doing that and being willing to share. You shared a lot of your own life. And so I recognize that's not always easy.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Thank you so much.
I remember at one point I was doing the dishes and listening to you, and you were talking about, I think you've recently had a baby and you were decided you're going to start a business about for birth announcements. And you kind of just randomly posted about that. And I remember having to stop and laugh, but also feel convicted because I said, that's how this podcast started. Okay. I was like, oh, okay. But yeah, how was it for you writing that book and kind of sharing a lot of your life in that book?
Oh, it was very hard, but it was also very healing to be able to share some of my stories. It really inspired a lot of reflection. I thought I had really processed a lot of my diagnosis at the point of writing that book, but there was still more there to think about. But I really appreciate your comment that it meant something to you, because as you were saying that, I was thinking about the people in my community that were that person for me that shared their stories. And they were people that I knew in real life when I started sharing about my daughter's diagnosis, that started talking to me about, oh, I have ADHD too. And maybe you do too, Meredith. And being able to see yourself in others' experiences and feel less alone, that was so critical for me. So I'm so grateful for your comments on that, and that it could do that for you as well.
Yeah, I know. I've recommended it to quite a few people as well, and said, not that I think they have ADHD, but just as they, like you said, have a child going through that or have an older child who has recently been diagnosed, kind of sharing so they can get a better understanding. And I think that's what your book helped. I mean, obviously helped me, but then just also I know others have said it just helped them to see kind of a different perspective of ADHD and through a different lens. So yeah, thank you. And thank you. Yeah, again, just for you shared so much of your life in that. And I get the idea that it's a long process to once you have a diagnosis or going down that. If you don't mind sharing, what was that like for you? Like you mentioned that you thought you'd processed a lot of it, but there were still things still kind of there where you're processing. But how was that kind of whole process for you?
It was a really interesting process for me. So I was diagnosed with ADHD following my daughter's diagnosis. I feel like the light bulb went off almost immediately when I was filling out her paperwork, and more light bulbs with the conversations I was having with her providers. And it was so interesting because at the time I with your kids, you see pieces of yourself in them, but she wasn't my kid that I related to the most in terms of personality. So I was surprised to think, oh my gosh, all of this fits me too. But we presented in really different ways. So, at first I felt like this feeling of, oh my gosh, I finally have an answer for why I've always felt different, for why I've been struggling on the inside, but nobody really could see that or really understood why. So there was a whole lot of relief in the early days. There's also a lot of confusion because even though it felt so right, there was still a huge part of me that was like, oh, no, 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 you're being dramatic about this. You're making this up. This isn't you. You did fine in school. You just want to have a problem. Like, I think we hear a lot of messages from society that people are like seeking labels and people are making excuses and things like that. And so among that relief, there was also this feeling of like, is this really right? Is this really the answer here? So I did actually pursue that formal diagnosis and, received the answer that I clearly met the diagnostic criteria for ADHD. And that was a comfort. And then at that time, it had been a little while because I did kind of stay in that self-diagnosed phase for a while. And what surprised me about getting the formal diagnosis was once it was really confirmed, I felt quite a bit of grief too, that took me by surprise because I had felt so comforted by the answer at first to suddenly feel this feeling of, oh my gosh, now I'm thinking back to all of the things in my life that I pursued, but I wasn't able to follow through with, that I have regrets around. Would it have been different if I had understood my brain better? There was just a lot of feelings of wishing my experience going through life was a little bit different, and maybe it could have been had I had these answers earlier. So that was definitely a part of it as well.
You mentioned as you were filling out forms for your daughter, kind of realizing you held some of these traits. What would you say to the parent who is filling out those forms for their kid and going, "Ooh, I have some of these traits"? What would you recommend to them?
I always recommend to parents, if they have a neurodivergent child, to ask where the genetic component might be in their family. So sometimes it's the mother, father, sometimes it's the grandparent, but oftentimes if you are having those light bulbs go off, like explore them. ADHD is highly hereditable. So it's something like 80%. So there's just this huge genetic component there. So it makes sense that if a child has ADHD, it's in that family lineage somewhere. And I do think that oftentimes as parents, we are so focused on getting support for our kids, to understand our kids better and make sure they are thriving, that we put our own needs aside. So oftentimes I talk to parents that are pretty sure they have ADHD, but getting answers for themselves is not as much of a priority. They feel like they're doing fine when really they're like doing fine-ish. They could be doing a lot better. And I thought I was doing a great job supporting my kids. And then I supported myself better. And I learned about my own needs and started accommodating my ADHD. And I feel like that was the missing piece to being able to like really take it to the next level of being able to connect and support my kids better.
Yeah, that's a really good point of realizing caring for you is also caring for your kids. And like you said, that kind of missing piece of, just being a better parent. So that's a really good point. You have talked about support. What could that look like for a family who is full of neurodivergent traits and diagnoses?
Support can be so difficult in our society today. We're so hyper independent that we don't have the built-in support systems that, many generations ago they had. We're missing a lot of community and things like that. In our family, we really do stress that community piece. So I think of our little family as our own community, and we all contribute in different ways and support each other and try to help each other when we're struggling with anything. And then I always really try to cultivate community for myself and help my kids figure out how to cultivate community for themselves. Because oftentimes with ADHD, we're dealing with these struggles that other people don't understand. So when we are keeping those all internal, it's really, really hard for us to even know what we need and know what can work. But if we have a community of people that we can be open with and talk about these things, they might be struggling with similar things. And together we might be able to form ways to better lift each other up.
And how do you model or teach your kids to kind of talk about their needs and communicate those?
I ask a lot of questions. Oftentimes, I really talk to them when they're struggling with someone. I try to teach them to ask themselves questions too. Curiosity is such a huge focus in our family. Oftentimes, when we're arguing, we have to take a pause and be like, "Okay, am I telling right now, or can I get more curious about this situation?" So that's something that I think has been hugely important for my kids. Also, really helping them develop self-awareness around what their symptoms look like, what's driving their behaviors. If they have a behavior that they know is not benefiting them and they're not liking the outcome from their behavior, asking them what are some ideas or strategies or ways that they think might help. So instead of always just telling my kids, here's what's going to help you, sometimes you have to give them some ideas and a place to start, but really co-creating solutions with them instead of for them.
Yeah, that's really good. Helping them think for themselves because they're going to one day be out in the world and need to do that. So that's a good thing. How have you been able to kind of, again, model and teach them to advocate for themselves in different situations?
This one I think is I'm not the best parent always. I don't want to sound like I'm this perfect mom that's done everything right. But my middle child, the first one that was diagnosed with ADHD, is such an excellent advocate for herself. And I hear from teachers and people all the time about that. And again, I think it was the really early shift from, okay, you're doing this wrong, let's fix it, to like, let's understand this and let's understand your needs. My daughter especially has gotten really, really good at understanding her needs and being able to communicate them to other people. At times I've had to model that. Oftentimes if I am looking to accommodate myself or I'm doing something to accommodate myself, I'll just share that with them. Like if I'm having an afternoon where I'm feeling really stuck on the couch and I don't have the motivation to like start making dinner or doing something in the afternoon that I like wanted to do, I'll be like, hey, can you do your homework out at this table while I make dinner? Because it helps me to have somebody else in the room to feel accountable to so that they have words to put to their strategies and so that they can communicate that to their teachers. One example is my daughter had this really great teacher one year that also had ADHD. And my daughter presents with a lot of hyperactivity. So she has more of the presentation people will typically say is like the boy presentation, which I hate that we put labels on that. But she has a lot of energy. So her teacher, often would choose her to run an errand for her if she needed like the attendance taken to the office, things like that. And, one day my daughter had asked me, she's like, yeah, I'm always the person that gets to do these things. And I'm like, oh, I think your teacher's giving you an accommodation and that's really great. maybe next year when you have a different teacher and you're finding that you really need to move and you can't sit in your seat, like that's a suggestion you can make to your teachers. And she started doing that. And now she's in high school and she still is that person that like will do the job for the teacher and she loves it. And it's helped her really, I think, learn that there's no shame in needing things to be a little bit different for her. And that sometimes there's pretty simple solutions that can make a big difference for how she experiences life.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
This episode is brought to you by Walmart. New beauty is in bloom at Walmart, and it's all about springtime radiance. From Drybar, Tula Skincare, and hundreds more available online, Walmart has the premium brands you want and this season's on-trend products for flawless, glossy hair and hydrated skin. Big name beauty brands? Check. The things you love? Check. Find trending spring beauty and all you need to look and feel gorgeous at Walmart, on app and online.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, kind of helping them realize that because it's happening this year doesn't mean it's going to happen next year, but they can offer that. That's a really good tool to kind of, encourage kids to take on their own kind of advocacy, but also recognize what they need and how they can help, like with a positive solution. So that's a really good, I might have to do that for my son has ADHD. Yeah, he's the one that goes for the jobs. He has quite a few jobs. And so I might need to start talking about that for next year even and just doing that. So that's a good point. What kind of things do you use in your life to help you stay organized as a mom and someone who, has a job and kind of all the different hats that you wear?
There's a lot of things I do. Some of them I do super consistently, and sometimes I don't do them as consistently. One thing that I really like about my habits right now is that I spend every Monday with my community in a planning meeting. So we have a Monday meeting that I facilitate it, but I also participate in it. And we spend about 5 to 10 minutes doing our own planning process. And then we share with the group what our intentions are for the week. And so during the planning process, I really struggle with anything that goes away. So I really struggle with calendars inside of apps. I can't use the planner where the cover closes. I need to be able to see it right in front of me. So I have a couple of notepads that are laid out. One is a weekly view and one is a daily view. So I always start with my weekly view, put my meetings on the calendar, write down any projects that need to be touched that week. And then I go through my daily views and transfer those meetings again. And it sounds like a lot, but for me, I'm so visual that I need to see like, where are my time blocks? What's going to be realistic to put on my calendar? And it really helps me be able to get an overview of like, okay, how much capacity do I really have this week for extra things? Do I need to get some help with things because I like way overshot the moon with what I put on my calendar? What's happening here? And then, so that first step is kind of like seeing like, okay, do things need to go? What can I add? That type of piece. And then day by day, I look at that daily view and remind myself, because I've learned that my brain's not going to hold on to that information. Like I'll think I know what's in front of me, but I don't always know what's in front of me. So being able to have that visual view is really helpful. And the fact that it's a routine that people are showing up to and that we're accountable to each other to show up to this meeting and take this time, it really helps me be super consistent with that practice.
Yeah, that's really smart to think through. How are you going to be held accountable? I think that's something that I even say to certain people, like, I need you to know that I need to get this done this week. So ask me on Friday if I did it. And if I know that they know, they don't have to ask, but I'll still like feel that pressure. And so, having that weekly time, I can see it be really beneficial because every week people are going to be there and hold you accountable. So I also think it's, I always say out of sight, out of mind. So calendars, if they're not in front of me, or it sounds really mean, not to accept like people necessarily. I still remember my husband when he goes to work, but it's that like, if we go on holiday, I don't think about work. I'm very good at not thinking about things happening that aren't necessarily like in front of me, which can be a good thing, but also can not be a good thing. And so, yeah, having those calendars, that sounds like a really good way to just have it always in front of you. I set reminders for everything. My phone is constantly going off, which annoys my husband, but works for me and helps me to kind of know.
Yeah, I use a lot of reminders too. I have a reminder every day to pick my kids up from school, which a lot of people would probably be like, "Oh my gosh, you need to remember your kids." And it's not that I forget them. It's just I think that people with ADHD, we get hyper focused on things, so we don't even know what time it is half the time. So those reminders can definitely be very important.
Yeah, most of the reminders aren't things I necessarily, like you say, forget about. It's just I need to be reminded of what time it actually is, because I can think that job's going to take me 10 minutes to write an email, but then I get distracted and see another email that I then respond to. And then, I've now sat there for 30 minutes and my kids are waiting at the school. So reminders for me are that kind of, it's just that shift of attention and being like, oh, yep, okay, now I need to go, or I need to finish wrapping up or whatever. So what would you say to someone who is an adult but is just kind of learning that they have ADHD? What would you say could be the first step in helping them understand themselves better?
Yeah, I think that that first time when you're realizing you have ADHD can be like kind of exciting, but it can also be super overwhelming. When I realized I had ADHD, it's like a blessing and a curse, right? I feel like there's a lot less information out there. There was a lot less access. Social media hadn't really been, talking about it in the way that it is now. There were a lot less articles. A lot of the information, the books were about children. There was maybe one or two books about adult ADHD out there. So, my experience might be different than somebody that's finding out today. But, from the clients and the members of my community I've worked with, a lot of them do talk about how it can easily become like this obsession at first, where like everything feels like it's ADHD. And honestly, a lot of things are, because it's our brain. It's how our brain's wired. So a lot of things will probably really start to make sense. But we also are getting bombarded with so many different pieces of advice. We are given all these strategies. There's a lot of apps out there now. And oftentimes we can fall prey to feeling like we have to find that optimal choice of managing this. And we're going to find this perfect solution to accommodate and manage our ADHD in our life. And that sort of becomes the quest, when I think that we have to take a slower approach sometimes, because if we try to do all of those things to change everything immediately, we're going to just end up super overwhelmed. We're going to feel like none of the things work. And it can kind of create this powerless feeling. So I always recommend people vet your information, find a few sources that you trust with their information that you're learning from. You don't have to follow every single ADHD account out there. Follow a few. Make sure you are, when you start trying new things and trying new strategies, try one or two things at a time. Don't try to do the overhaul immediately, because it's going to be really hard for you to differentiate what's working and what's not. So I really suggest building your toolbox over time, because some strategies are going to work sometimes, some are not. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're good or bad. But if we're super all or nothing about our approach, we're going to think that, there's, it's either too much to try to do all the things or nothing's working. So be patient and go slow, which is against our nature a little bit. But, with support, you can be reminded of that. And I think that's really important.
Yeah. Yeah. That's, like you said, very much against our nature, but very important, so that we can see actually what is working and what's not, and adapt to what we need to, versus throwing it all away and then starting all over again, which could be not work or could not work. You talk about community, having community. How could someone go and find a community for ADHD, or maybe even raising a child with ADHD?
Yeah, I think that starting where your feet are is really great. Who's in your local community? If your children are in school, that's a great place to talk to their providers, find out if there's any groups for neurodivergent kids around you. I also personally found just as I'm meeting new people and talking to new people, being open about the fact that my kids have ADHD and I have ADHD and communicating that a lot was actually the best way for me to find my people because, you know, you find really quickly, like people usually are willing if you share like, oh yeah, that's my kid too, or that's me too, or that's my brother. And so I think that if you are feeling comfortable enough with being able to disclose, I think that's a really great way to start building that. And then just intentionally creating ways to interact with those people, like find those other parents that have ADHD or have a child with ADHD and be like, hey, can we have lunch once a month? And try to do something that has some kind of reoccurrence because oftentimes we have that one play date or that one meeting and it's great, but like it's hard to be consistent with those things. So have that monthly, the fourth Wednesday or something like that. And then try to make sure that you're always putting the next meeting on the calendar. Yeah. So I think one of the biggest things that we struggle with is people are afraid to be that person to reach out and want to connect. And when we sense from someone that they're looking for that too, just taking that step to be honest and see if you can set something up. And that can go a long way to feeling like you're not alone in all of this.
Yeah, that's a really good idea of setting it up, but like before you leave, if that makes sense. Like, so being like, yeah, let's just do this every fourth Wednesday, or before you leave that coffee, be like, hey, can we get another date in now? Because I know it's like, you know, my life is chaotic in the sense that I have 2 kids and I have a business and I do other work and just all of life. It could just be months before and then I'm like, oh, we've not seen each other for months. So having that already.
Yeah. And then finding that common time takes another month to figure out. And, you know, that's the cycle I was in with a lot of my friends for a long time. And now I've tried to adopt that habit where even if we are like, oh, I don't know, that's going to be a tricky time, like let's still put it on the calendar because when that rolls around, it's at least going to cue you to be like, okay, well, I have to cancel this time, but we can set the next time. So it kind of helps with that tendency a lot of people with ADHD have to see what's right in front of them. So, you know, it's not that we don't care about these friends. It's not that we don't want to see them, but we aren't always thinking about it in the moment and at a time where we can reach out. So I know a lot of people with ADHD say they have those friends that they like talk to once a year and they can pick up where they left off. And that's great, but don't you want to see them a little bit more than that? And I think that can help with that a lot by just being a little bit more aware of keeping something on the calendar.
Yeah, that's really smart. I'm going to have to do that now. After our call, I'm going to text a couple of friends and be like, hey, let's do this more regularly. So the last question I ask is, what do you want the world to know about neurodiverse people?
I want the world to know that if someone that is neurodiverse is telling you they're struggling, they really are. It's not an excuse. Their brain is wired differently. So even if you don't understand why that thing might be hard for them, it is hard for them. And on the flip side of that, I would want people to understand that while there are these struggles that are unique to our brains, there's also some really incredible strengths. So while we have to see those struggles and accommodate those struggles and acknowledge them, don't forget about all of the really positive things that these brains bring to the world. Because when we really focus on strengths, then we are more grounded, we feel more aligned, and, you know, we're just more able to fully contribute to our experience.
Well, thank you very much, Merideth, for being on the podcast and for sharing more insight as well as writing a great book. But thank you very much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Hey, if you found this episode helpful or think a friend might find it helpful, why not send them a link and let them know why you think they might enjoy it? Thanks for joining into the conversation and see you next week.